Welcome to Dilated Peoples of the Caribbean Part 19. In this episode, we're going to be moving things into the 1800s or the 19th century. A lot was going on in Europe with the Napoleonic era. They were at war internally. So geopolitically, that had ramifications in regards to colonial control. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, fires of discontent or eruptions of rebellion were starting to gather pace on all of the islands, sort of pushing towards emancipation, or the sign for emancipation was quite close to coming, right? So we're going to just touch on a couple of the rebellions that were going on at that period, even though there were many more to mention. But we're going to focus on three rebellions that I'm going to go into today. So anyway, let's get into this right now. Let's start off. The 18th century represented a transition of societal consciousness in Europe, coupled with the greed of swelling slave numbers spinning towards outbreaks of near anarchy was to be anticipated. What may have been a tipping point could have been the feudal play for supremacy that Europeans were exacting against one another, as gunfire and weaponry took bounds of sophistication on a relatively small landmass in comparison to the rest of the world. This eventuality, often overlooked by those who blame Europeans when the pen should be written against power merchants who calculate loss of life not too dissimilar to one's accounting of their end-of-year tax return, could be those, in butterfly effect, exploiting the poor to average citizens they presumed regency over. Due to European industrial exploits, powerhouses in manufacturing would also translate as formidable battlefield adversaries. Europeans may have handed down obsolete weaponry to Africans, but the latest apparatus of devastation would have been on hand to target practice against themselves. Entering the late 1700s and coinciding with volcanic fault line themes of revolution, the newest superpower to upset the apple cart were the French. Could it be that French aggression caused the equilibrium of geopolitics to wobble, that saw Europeans so inwardly focused on supremacy that profits from overseas colonies collectively lost financial relevance? Or overstretched what Europe could accept as profitability that cannot rival the reinforcement of protection at home? In any instance, colonial administrations were showing signs of empirical dusk, as all empires reach an extinguishing point. Whilst France and Britain were gearing up for conflict, their plantations in the Americas would have unequivocally suffered disrepair. The lack of police visibility in an ever-heightening black to minority white ratio demography in the Caribbean must have put slave masters on the back foot. The time was nigh, approaching the age of Caribbean revolution. The first major play of significance was overthrow of the French slave masters in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, that coincidentally saw them rout the French at their Napoleonic pinnacle, but sometimes many sporting champions will opinion being on top maintains a continual, stressful position that culminates in Point Break. So there we have it. On what you could say the geopolitical scale, the Europeans were having internal warfare. The French and the British were looking to collide, and it meant potentially their colonies, they may have taken their eye off the ball and they may have suffered disrepair. This obviously allowed for the Africans to mount spirited movements of rebellion. Also, they would get news back that potential emancipation of slavery was near. They would get news back filtered slowly but surely that they were about to be free from slavery potentially. And they wouldn't have had the numbers because they were so concentrated on what was going on in Europe right at the time. And then obviously to start things off, you had the island of Haiti, modern day, or Hispaniola you could say, but modern day Haiti in particular, which is the west side of Hispaniola. They put up a front. They got the French out. The French sent reinforcements, 50,000 soldiers, which was spoken about in Bastions of Cultural Freedom, another video of a series of mine. And the French were routed and obviously sent packing, and the Haitians were the first independent former slave republic in the Americas, something to be proud of, that obviously set the tone for the next century, because independence was what it was going to be about in the 1900s, away from the colonial empires and just getting back your sovereignty of a land that you probably worked for 300 years, or your ancestors did, right? So this is where we're at the moment. The slaves are starting to rebel. It's starting to get out of control. The Europeans have spread themselves quite too thinly, if you know what I mean, and they're concentrating on keeping their own house in order, and that gives way to the space for the rebellions to not be contested in the way they may have been centuries before. But obviously over time, evolution, people get smarter, people get braver, and the slaves were obviously given an impetus to start to rebel and face the repercussions, basically, of which they were still major, but they were close to, they could feel it now that they were going to be free very, very soon if they just push. But anyway, let's move on. The Haitian Revolution and subsequent winning of independence over the equivalent of the USA or China today in terms of comparable power echoed the drum of independence throughout the whole entire Caribbean. Revolts around this period had been occurring regular contractions. First, there was Bussa's rebellion in Barbados. Second was the rebellion of Demerara in Guyana. And third, just years before emancipation, was the Baptist War in Jamaica. Bussa was a plantation slave driver in Barbados that led revolt in 1816 against the slave masters, as abolition had been murmuring on the grapevine. False rumours had spread throughout the Bayesian slave population that Westminster had passed legislation that was to release African slaves. An additional caveat of suspicion was news that the progress of slavery rights, legislation and developments was being concealed by the political hierarchy. The slave population, led by Bussa, launched rebellion and went on the rampage. A significant portion of the island's sugarcane harvest was set alight, devastating crop forecasts and jeopardizing British control. In the ensuing aftermath, the British military would seek to display superiority and dominance that saw them go on a mission of bloodthirsty purge. The rebellion was quashed in just 2 days and nights. During and post-revolt, many culprits, instigators and participants that fought for freedom were slain by the British Army stationed in Barbados. Attempting to rule with an iron resolve, the slave masters decided to make an example of those that disobeyed. In the end, hundreds of black African slaves were culled in combat. Kangaroo courts were executed in brutal fashion that was designed to spread control via the ruthless medium of public seminar. There was never revolts or events of this nature in Barbados again. So there we have it. Bussa, the Bayesian national hero, 1816, decided to incite his fellow slaves to go on a rampage in Barbados as discontent was brewing in regard to emancipation. They were getting murmurs back that they had already been freed by Westminster, which wasn't probably the case at the time, but no doubt they were getting frustrated and wanting to be let out of the cage of slavery. And, they were dealt with within a couple of days, but it had a point of significance because they'd had no rebellions of that standing up until that point. So it just shows the end was nigh. It was becoming closer and closer and closer that these people are going to be pushing for emancipation, and eventually they will get there, but not just yet. However, they were still made an example of, and Bussa too was made an example of, and he goes down as like a national hero alongside the Kojo story that I was saying about in the last episode. He's not just a Bayesian hero, he's obviously a Caribbean hero and an African hero, Bussa, listening to the name, you know. And I just wanted to say once again, like, you know, on those small islands, you know, I can feel it. I take my mind and I go in and I feel it, right? And as I was saying, you meet Grenadans, people like that, yeah, they're quite strong people, right? And can you imagine what it would take for, like, say 100 slaves to be controlled by, say, 5 white slave masters or something like that? Could you imagine what it would be like? Yeah, what kind of atmosphere would it need to be? Think about 100 guys that you know right now. How could 5 guys control them that are white or whatever and make them work against their will? See, it's the psychology of oppression, which we was talking about before, where it's beset upon the mind, upon a people, right? And it just draws away the spirit and the energy into you not even wanting to fight back as a people. And it can happen. It's like a depression. And it's an oppression, right, of a people, and they just can't get out. They just can't release the psychological shackles from anything, from being put down as a people, right? So to come away from that and to break those chains psychologically, and then go on to like lead and mount a serious rebellion that saw many of the crops, many of the sugarcane crop or harvest of Barbados go up in flames. That was something, because the repercussions would have been severe. They would have known the repercussions would have been severe. And to do that, go through with it, and then obviously be made an example of, which is quite sad, you know, is something to obviously always never forget, and is a serious footnote in the history and the struggle of black people to free themselves of slavery, you know. And it just shows like it just wasn't Europe deciding. Yes, they were becoming more conscious, but the African slaves were becoming more and more brazen, more and more discontent, and more wanting to, you know, come back to themselves, be in reunion with themselves, and be controllers of their own beings, you know. So once again, kudos to Bussa. You know, you're never forgotten, and yeah, like I'm very, very proud, and all you guys should be too, you know. But yeah, I must say, like, they must have been doing to control like that many slaves, and it's just a few white slave masters predominantly, right? They must have been doing some wicked things on them islands. Wickedness. Yeah, can you imagine? To control like boisterous men, yeah? Can you imagine what the climate would have been like? That the climate, can you imagine the climate of fear that you would need to preside over to keep people like that in check? What kind of brutality would that need to be carried out in order for the rest of the people to like toe the line? Can you imagine? They were doing some wicked things on them islands, man. On them small islands. Forget about Jamaica. Them small islands in the Caribbean, I know it. They were doing wicked things, and that's why you're such a strong race of people, because they were doing wicked things to keep you in check. Even it could have been like even if like sometimes they'd probably like go for the strongest slave as well, just to like set an example. So it just wasn't even you being as strong. You had to be smart, you know, clever, you know, to like not come get yourself focused upon, you know. And it was real terrific tough times, and whoever got through that, who's here today, you're a champion. Anyway, once again, kudos to the Bayesian national hero, Bussa. The Demerara Rebellion in 1823, just a few years after, was another tale of frustration. Roughly 1,000 slaves formed. Once again, the troubles were over bad treatment and eagerness for emancipation. Once the rebellion had quelled, ringleaders and those thought to be involved were rounded up and served darkening justice. Few would receive the verdict of reprieve. Many would face cold-blooded executions that would have been displayed the fanfare of high visibility. Dead bodies of the freedom fighters were left scarecrowed at plantations in focal positions to rot. The message to slaves the stench of decomposing bodies permeated the air with was way beyond threatening the individual to discourage them from future uprisings, as without caution next time many could suffer the same fate. Straight out of the Martin Luther King playbook, the rebellion took an approach of non-violence and dialogue. Plantation owners, overwhelmed, would be held captive and were informed they would remain untouched. Only a handful of whites were killed, as the rebellion had the characteristics of union protest that would mirror modern fashion when expressing discontent with power. The difference once again was the strict brutality that had been meted out by men seeking vengeance with an inhumane lash. Right, so a few years later, 1823, in the Demerara region of British Guyana, the slaves decided to rebel, but by and large it was peaceful protest against slavery and conditions, working conditions, However, it wasn't seen that way by the powers that be. They saw it as disruptive, to say the least. It was eventually quelled, and with it being quelled, once again, all the instigators and some were sacrificed for the cause and were made examples of by their dead bodies being left outside of plantations and left to rot, so people would see it day by day, the stench of decomposing bodies that African slaves would have to see of their brothers and sisters day by day, and just watch their bodies rot over whatever time and not be able to touch them, give them an honourable funeral or whatever. They were totally dehumanized and stripped down, and this is what happened with, by and large, you would say, peaceful protest, and not good really. A real sad tale to hear that was happening in Guyana at the time. But again, this was another significant push towards freedom, and so people like that, were sacrificed for people like me, is how I see it directly, and is exactly how I see it and how you should see it. People like that are not here now and sacrificed themselves for someone like me or you. No matter what you say, they had to come. Something had to come before us, and that was what was there in Guyana, which is obviously part of the Caribbean as well and part of the British colonial empire. So kudos to Demerara region and the slaves and their ancestors that fought against oppression, and it just shows like how the brutality was going across all the colonies to keep these slaves under control, because the swelling numbers was now getting too much and something was going to give, and eventually it would, but just not yet. It needed a few more years, a little bit more time. Anyway, let's move on. Jamaica was next to rise above complaint, sensing that something had to give, as the island's enslaved population of 300,000 began to grow impatient of news regarding the relaxing of laws that would afford better rights, a working wage, and the long-standing light of emancipation. The Baptist War of 1831 was the highest level of dissidence ever recorded in the Caribbean slave era. With the introduction of religious worship that should have been forementioned in the Demerara Rebellion, the slave masters generally had mixed views on whether it was a good idea to allow mass worship. The reason being is, on the first account, it would be used as a pathway of enlightening the forlorn spirit that was conditioned to believe that it had to have come from all things monstrous. On the second account, worshipping the same God would begin to redefine human class. The slave master's actions would be cross-referenced chapter and verse. To maintain reason of social entitlement, it would have been uncomfortable sitting for any European in the Caribbean. On the third account, the notion of equality supported by religious text would have formed a concoction of bewilderment for the slave masters, but a clarification of self-esteem that could be wielded as a tool to set the spirit and mind free, regardless of its existence to the flesh and its earthly struggle. On the other hand, complacent slave masters would use religious attendance to drive home insignificance and reaffirmation of the stereotype that the dark-skinned African was born a sinner, that to be forgiven must bend knee, and dare not stand for righteousness. In the end, of what had been introduced as a wicked tool of discipline by the oppressors, in turn became the very weapon that organised the fight back. At its height, 60,000 African slaves from plantation to plantation, parish to parish, went on the tribalist rampage. Near anarchy ensued. The African chattel slave soon to become forefather of the Jamaican citizen, embodied the mood of the rioting, rampaging hooligan, and set out to mash up everything. Explosive sprint power was used to set alight a record number of cane fields. 300 years of being demonized, vexations were taken out against anything of value to the slave masters. Slave masters were reliant on reference of good behaviour towards the slaves they owned as the credit required for survival of this social hurricane. If not, it stood to reason for harboured grievances. Slave masters were rendered indebted to the cutlass of heaven's passport. The rebellion had reached the 11th day, with the country in tatters, and a lack of messianic leadership or direction was to begin its receded twilight. Aided by the barrel of British guns on shift, an almighty purge against the most stubborn resistance was carried out. A final blow before the bell of emancipation rang and saw the revolting slaves suffer extreme casualties that were the shields needed for the whole of dancehall to bogle into the night 2 centuries later. So there we have it, just a few years shy of emancipation in 1834. The Jamaicans in 1831, with a 300,000 population, 60,000 of them decide to go on rebellion, or on the rampage as I call it. A record number of crops were burnt from parish to parish, town to town in Jamaica. You know, they went haywire, yeah? And it was all about just becoming free, getting their freedom. You know, they wanted their freedom. They could sense that freedom was close, and it was only a few years away. I must sort of add in as well that, you know, a lot of Caribbeans will often speak amongst themselves that religion was brought to them in the Caribbean as a tool of control, which it may well have been, you know, but sometimes, you know, the wickedest tool that the oppressor uses against you is actually the weapon that God has sent to use back against them, you know, or you wouldn't be allowed to have it, you know. But anyway, that being said, you know, it allowed for mass gatherings. Like religion, they wouldn't have been able to have mass gatherings for any other reason apart from carnival, which was settled once per day, yeah. But being able to worship once a week, they were able to establish gatherings and crowds of people that would obviously be able to speak and conversate. And once that happened, that allowed them to gather the numbers needed to mount a serious rebellion. Also, on the other hand, now, you know, it would have presented a little bit of a spiritual conundrum for the slave masters, because then they had a book that would speak with reason to everybody and would establish the fact that it was a human race. So that alone there would have presented issues to the slave masters, and some of them may have liked it. They thought it would have kept them more tranquil, but then others would have seen that, yeah, this is making them believe that they are me, when before then they were brainwashed. Like they would have forgotten about Africa by then, and they would be sold into the idea or the notion or the concept of, societal order, which is a black person is at the bottom and a white person is at the top and light skin is in between, is the way it was for hundreds of years, right? So why would it be any different moving forward? That's just the way it is. And also as well, they were made to believe that they were black for a reason and that all things black were evil. So to read something that was speaking about you on an even playing field with people and not evil and you were all God's children, etc., etc., it would have risen spirits. So it was the Christians, I would say, the Christians in the Demerara Rebellion and also in Jamaica that were behind the rebellions. They were that it was people that were attending churches, and it was the church leaders that were, or those that were high up in the churches that sacrificed themselves to move the rebellion forward. And it must obviously be noted, so it was channeled, the rebellions were channeled through religion, and it was channeled through them. So it was them that that were able to muster up the courage and also as well just gather the numbers. Because can you imagine, like, even now you say there's a couple of thousand people down Trafalgar Square. Can you imagine 60,000 people, African people, going wild on an island in Jamaica? Can you imagine that? I mean, like, have you ever watched on and you've seen like 10 or 15 black men in the street, like, going at each other? Have you ever seen that? Like, outside it's something to watch. I'm being honest with you. When you see 15 men going at it, black men as well, going wild or whatever, as I've seen a couple of times. Yeah. It's crazy. Do you know what I mean? It's something to watch. It's a spectacle. Can you imagine? And also the feeling of like taking the chains away and just like going on the rampage and just destroying everything that's worth something to these people, and for good reason, not like now with what they do now and whatever else, but for then it was with good reason. Could you imagine how those people would have felt? The feeling of just going on a rampage and just having what they think is short term, short lived, but living their freedom. Do you know what I mean? But through rampage. Do you know what I mean? But again, once again, the British did obviously quell the rebellion, and it was sort of extinguished, and a lot of instigators again were put to task, and shame, because just a couple of years later now they would have been free subjects legally, technically and spiritually, as the emancipation had reached its boiling point, So anyway, let's move on. But yeah, those are the three rebellions that are targeted and that I wanted to just speak to you about, and I hope each one has left an indentation upon you. And yeah, all good. Anyway, let's move on. Right, so that brings this episode to its culmination. Hope you've enjoyed it. Once again, I've definitely enjoyed this one. So we had the Demerara Rebellion in Guyana, which was largely a peaceful protest, but turned violent, not by the actual demonstrators, but actually by the slave masters, who took out a route of brutality against the defenseless slaves, because they would have had the munitions, the slaves wouldn't, right? He then had Bussa, the Bajan national hero, leading from the front, and he is their national hero now. I've seen statues, which you'll see in the video, no doubt. And yeah, he's got a real point of significance, because at the end of the day, Barbados is actually kind of the British capital of slavery in the Americas, you could say. Apart from the USA, which is technically not theirs, but it is sort of. But yeah, in the Caribbean, Barbados was the first place that they categorized as a colony, as a British colony, and it was given to Britain and the Crown for 300 years of free, absolute free labour, right? So good that Bussa, after 300 years ago, stood from the front and turned on the oppressors. Because as a slave driver, I believe, like, he would have had some type of seniority in society afforded to him by the slave masters. So he would have been in with them at first, but then after educating himself to what was right, he decided to go on the offensive and defend his people by offence, And yeah, long live Bussa. You know, you're not forgotten. You know, he's my ancestor. Could be my cousin. How do I know? Right? Definitely, right? Because if you're on them islands for 300 years, you probably are related, yeah, right, in some way, shape, or form. So, yeah, big up Bussa. And then also, just lastly, the Baptist War or the Christmas War, they call it, in Jamaica, 1831, just a few years prior, had significant ramifications. I didn't say this earlier, but that news, all this news would have been fed back to the Europeans and especially the British in Westminster. You had the Wilberforce situation with them pushing for emancipation and stuff like that on their side because Europe was becoming more conscious. Obviously, religion had a major part to play because it was now starting to see that we're all, no matter our colour, we're all one. That had a massive part to play and was a weapon that was weaponized basically, and it was a tool used to maybe counteract against the black African, but they managed to harness the power and turn it back towards the oppressor and free themselves of chains. So it is to be mentioned, it is to be noted, and it has to be highlighted. It's as simple as that. And no matter which way, if you don't like it or not, that's up to you. But that's what it was, you know. Back then, it was those people in the churches that gathered the crowds and gathered the number to turn against the slave masters, you know, who also would have had, you know, episodes of like, am I actually as great as I say I am? Am I meant to be at the top of society? You know, it's kind of a birth of like equal opportunity or equal rights or seeing each other equally. You know, it was happening there in Jamaica. You know, so good to know. Good for all of you guys to know. Anyway, also on top of that, like you know, it must be mentioned as well. The Europeans were wearing thin. You know, the Napoleonic era had a devastating effect, I would say, on the Europeans' ability to manage their colonies. You know, it would have massive effect. You know, and obviously, what we're going to go into, moving more into sort of contemporary, is, you know, why like they had to switch focus, because obviously once again technology improvements, you know, it was switching from industrial to now needing material goods. For whatever reason, Africa became the focus again. So, you know, the microscopic lens was on the Americas and the churning for the industrial age, but we're going into new times where material was needed, and for whatever reason, Africa became a bigger focus, and the whole continent this time, not just the coast. Anyway, hope this message reaches you well. Once again, deliver this message straight to your heart because it's from mine. All right, love. Anyway, take care. Love. One. Bless.